Greetings to those who watch below. Before we start today's video, I'd like to give a huge shout out to Steffi Ray, Wicked Witch, Jess Black Curtain, Aztec Priest and Lisa Watts for being those who dwell below, an exclusive channel membership that gives you shout outs at the start of every video. So today's stories are our paranormal roundup for the month. I know I'm leaving it late, but better late than never, eh? So, on with the stories. Creepy Gollum by RoseyWren. This is an ongoing story really. I've lived in this house for around 5 to 6 months now. Nothing notable has happened. Bangings around the house that I've just passed off as being the neighbours when my children aren't home, or the children if they are home, even if they're in the same room as me. It's easier to ignore that way. There have been a few loud ones that I couldn't pretend were either the neighbours or children though. It's not felt creepy or anything, so I've just been getting on with it. But recently I've had to accept that my peace from ghosties and ghoulies may not exist. Myself and both my daughters have had an experience now. The first experience was mine. This happened about a month ago. It was bedtime. I like to lay in bed and procrastinate. I can't sleep so I'm heavily pregnant at the moment. It's quite late. Both the girls are snoring away in their bedroom, and I'm just relaxing, messaging friends and watching true crime videos. I have my back to the bedroom door and landing, and suddenly I feel a pressure on my bed. Even though it's memory foam, it has a distinctive feel when someone sits on the edge of the bed, and even the noise of someone sitting down. I just laid staring at my phone, thinking, nope, not today. Put my phone down and forced myself to go to sleep. The next night I felt the bottom of my bed being lightly kicked. Again, it's distinctive. Again, I noped. Then a few weeks ago, my eldest daughter, who was 6, and for the purpose of the story I'll call Bonnie, said she woke up one morning and me and her sister were still asleep. She decided to lay in bed and read. She said she heard someone whisper, "Bonnie," in her ear. She said she knew 100% it wasn't me or her sister, but she has also said she wasn't really scared. She was just confused. Then a week ago, my youngest, we'll call her Emily, had her experience. On Thursdays it's just me and her, as Bonnie is in school. I'll explain the layout of my downstairs a little for context. From the front door there is a corridor, and on the left is the front room door. In front there is the door to the dining room, which opens up to the kitchen, which is narrow. I'm at the end of the kitchen doing pots. Emily is at the other end of the kitchen talking away to me. All of a sudden, she swings her body all the way round and says, "Bonnie?" I remind her that Bonnie is still at school, and she looks at me confused, saying, "But I just heard and saw something crawling." She wanders off to the front room, and after a couple of seconds, she lets out a shriek like she'd seen a spider, and came running back to the kitchen where I was still doing the dishes. She told me it was in the front room. I asked her what it was, and she said she doesn't know, but it was pink. For the record, she thinks Caucasian skin tones are pink, and that it was crawling around. I said I couldn't see it, and she questioned how I couldn't see it, because it was there. I'm inwardly having a mild heart attack now, but try not to bring it up so she forgets, and hope it's just her imagination gone wild. We were having our dinner in the living room a little while later, and she tells me, "It's gone to the neighbours now, I think," and that it was scary. Later in the day, after her sister was home, I'm back in the kitchen making tea, when Emily crawls into the dining room from the front room like a creepier version of Gollum. She stands up and tells me that's how it moved. She said, "Did you see it, Mummy?" And I said no again met with confusion. Then she repeats herself that it was scary. I don't know what compelled me to ask, but I said, "Did it see you?" And she looked me right in the damn soul and said no, he didn't have any eyes. So I just have images of a bald, eyeless, Gollum-esque invisible creature crawling around my downstairs. She keeps reassuring me that it's not back, so there's that. I'm hoping the thing sitting on my bed was just a family member who passed away just checking on me, and that the whisperer was just keeping Bonnie company. and whatever Emily saw stays at the neighbour's house. Red-Eyed Children by JoJorocks. This happened in January 2019, over 2 years ago. I was riding a bus at the time. There were only 4 or 5 passengers left, including me, and it was 9:45 at night. The bus stopped, the door opened, and a girl entered. She was about 10 or 11 years old. Judging from the colour of her hair, she was European. I glanced at her, and she sat almost 7 or 8 seats away. As the bus moves, I continued staring at her. At first you wouldn't think anything of her, because she wore normal clothing, but her bangs were covering her eyes, and she was all alone. My thoughts were, what on earth is this girl doing at this time of night? Where are her parents? Why is she travelling alone without a parent or guardian? From time to time, I glanced at her. I started eating my taco, and when I'm done with my taco, I glanced at her again. She's staring back at me. Although I still couldn't see her eyes, I looked at my shoes and smiled. But when I looked at her again, a dreadful feeling engulfed me. I finally saw her eyes. They were blood red. She's staring back with bloodshot eyes. At this moment I was shaking with fear. I looked at the other passengers to see if they saw her red eyes too, but all of them were too busy with their own business that they didn't even notice she was there. Again, I stared at my shoes. The bus stopped. I heard footsteps. Even if I'm not looking, I sensed that it was the girl and she was staring at me. When her presence was gone, more passengers got on the bus. I thought that I could finally breathe easier, but when I stared at the window, I saw her in the field outside. This time, she's with around 10 more children. They looked to be aged from 6 to 16, all of them girls. The 2 smallest were holding teddy bears. They were all looking at me with those red eyes. Even as the bus drove away, they never broke their eye contact with me. At home I told my older sister what happened. Of course, she didn't believe me. Even my friends at work, when I told them about this, just laughed at me. But for me, it's not a funny experience. Soviet Sanitarium by Dreyk. Moving into our new downtown high-rise flat was a serious pain. Seriously, it took over a month from the time we purchased the apartment to when we could even start moving our belongings in. Then, we had to wait several more weeks for specific fixtures to arrive and get installed. The city was obviously experiencing a boom from new trade with China and Japan, and the housing growth was far exceeding the city's construction industry's capacity. The winter had been particularly cold as well, and although we were now in March, there was no sign the freezing temperatures and snow intended to abate. Babushka had also fallen ill with a particularly nasty bug, an even more nasty cure, which of course, thanks to her superstitious upbringing, meant she had to try all manner of strange, horrible-smelling salves and potions. Lydia took a small break from work to stay with her grandmother and help her during recovery. The memory of what I saw in her bedroom over the New Year holidays never fully left the back of my mind, however. Every time I'd make my way into her room to say hello or bring her a bowl of soup, I'd expect some presence to be felt, or some object to move. I refused to be left alone in that house again. Once the stress of the move had abated, and we were successfully moved into our new home, work began to take a much more structured and orderly pace, and our lives at last started to stabilise. It was time for my girlfriend and I to begin our adventure together. The first places we wanted to see were some of the former Soviet republics, which could be found along the country's southern and western borders, nations which, although freed in the early 1990s, never seemed to thrive in the same way that Russia proper had. Once the winter's icy grip had finally started to thaw, around late May, we flew from Vladivostok to Chelyabinsk, far away in the Caucasus, and from there we rented a car to drive to the border with Kazakhstan. The road was in excellent condition, as this was obviously a vital trade route, and we purred along nicely in our rented Chevy Cruze. Honestly, I probably would have preferred a good old Soviet-era larder to get more of the experience, but for whatever reason, none were to be had. At the border, we got quite a few stares from the security patrols and border police on both sides. It was obvious that very few tourists, or even European Russians, passed through this crossing. The region was populated almost entirely with native Tatar, Kazakh and Bashkir people. Notwithstanding the curious questions and glances, a few passport scans and a check for fruit and veg, and we were on our way south again, now in Kazakhstan. The first stop on our journey was to an abandoned sanitarium. Now, when you hear that term sanitarium, you most likely think of a privately run asylum, or perhaps a place where people with chronic illnesses would go to hopefully recover. However, in Europe and these Eurasian countries, they often had a very different use. They were simply locations where local citizens could go on a short vacation, escape from the stresses of the major industrial cities like Chelyabinsk or Omsk, and relax. They usually included a lot of steam rooms, pools, tennis courts, and maybe even a small football pitch. They were paid for by the workers' government-backed jobs, or were simply free in many cases, and were considered an essential part of a person's work year. With the fall of the Soviet Union, most of these places weren't bought up by private companies, and the government in most of these ex-satellite nations couldn't afford to maintain them. They were allowed to rot, and in some cases were filled with refugees from one post-Soviet war or another. This sanitarium, it appeared, was simply allowed to die a slow death. The grounds were secured, though in typical style, that really only meant a chain and padlock, both of which were long gone by the time we arrived. The white stucco facade in traditional Soviet Romanesque design was broken and scarred, with large cracks exposing the concrete and rebar skeleton within. Virtually every window had been broken out, most likely by area kids, who had also taken it upon themselves to cover every inch of the interior walls with graffiti. The building had obviously been vandalised as well following the fall, as most of the ornamental hammer and sickle emblems had been intentionally chiselled off the walls, and we come across the occasional bust of Stalin or Lenin with the face broken away. Moving down into the lower levels, we came across the Great Theatre, massive and panelled in false marble. The auditorium could probably have fit at least 2,000 people in its heyday, now silent and crumbling. Long, tattered mould-covered velvet curtains hung precariously on either side of the performance stage. The stage itself had more broken than intact boards, and several of the heavy projector lights had fallen from their perches in the rigging above, to puncture through the mossy stage like cannonball scars. Just to the right of the stage stood a tall, multi-panelled window, which, as with the others in the building, was entirely devoid of glass. As the faint sunlight filtered through, forming long rays in the swirling dust and mould spores, my girlfriend spotted what appeared to be an outline of a man, standing just to the side of the window frame. Tapping me on the shoulder, I turned to look at where she was motioning, and caught a glimpse of the man myself. Calling up to him in Russian, we tried to get his attention. "Hey," I called up to the form. With no answer, I called up again, more formally this time. "Good day." Still, there was no reply. For a moment, we wondered if this was perhaps a security guard, and that we were trespassing. The figure was rather clear in his position just beside the window, standing outside and looking down at us from perhaps 12 metres up the wall. Asking my girlfriend to wait there a moment, I stepped back through the entrance of the theatre and made my way quickly around the corner of the building, to the exterior wall adjacent to where the window stood. Pulling my mobile phone from my pocket, along with my passport, I quickly made my way up to the point where the man was standing. I stopped in my tracks as I found sheer wall. No place for a man, or anything to be standing at the exterior of the building outside that window. No balcony, or bridge, or walkway. Not only was there nowhere to stand, but there was no man there. Tapping my girlfriend's number into my phone, I placed a call and waited anxiously while it rang. "Hello," she answered softly. "Is the man still standing there?" I asked, trying not to give away the surprise and adrenaline in my voice. "Yes, he's still standing there, staring at me," she replied. I quickly explained that he could not be standing there, and why. The explanation causing her to ask me to stop and slow down several times. When it finally dawned on her what I was saying, she cursed softly into the phone and took off running toward the entrance. I also took off, closing the gap between us quickly as I could. When I saw her there, emerging from the Grand Theatre's gaping entrance, she was pale and shivering. We grabbed each other and both made our way back around to the exterior wall. We both knew what we'd find when we arrived, but something in our minds made us need to verify it to ourselves. As expected, there was only a sheer wall, a broken window, and no man there waiting when we reached the spot again. We discussed what had happened at length, verifying with each other that we had both indeed seen what we thought we had seen. When we were both convinced that neither of us were insane, we pressed on, back toward the larger of the buildings on the old Sanitarium campus. The building had obviously been the old administrative wing. It contained staff housing, offices, meeting space, and what looked to be rather official documents scattered all over the floor of several of the first floor rooms. The doors had been completely removed from the hinges and taken. They were probably made from valuable metal or contained ornate carvings. It was a prize too valuable to leave behind, and as was often the case with these abandoned structures, the treasures were immediately looted in the early 90s. One of the massive filing rooms contained what had to be 400 individual filing cabinets, lining both sides of a massive rectangular room. Between the rows of cabinets sat a dozen long tables with piles of old documents scattered all over. The roof had long failed, causing rain and snow to penetrate the room and turn these papers to mush, mixed with mould and grasses struggling to grow in a random scattering of penetrating sunbeams. Upon entering this room, both of us had an intense feeling of unease. There was definitely the sense that someone was watching us, though we were obviously the only two people in the room. Using our high-powered LED flashlights, we scoured every nook and cranny of the room, and the only people there were the two of us. The deeper into the records room, the harsher the sensation felt, until it was almost one of resentment, or even loathing. Calling out to the unseen energy, I tried to determine what it was, and what it wanted. Again, in Russian I spoke out. "Privet," I called out loudly. "Who are you? Do you want us gone?" We stood there in silence as my questions echoed through the room, our flashlights cutting beams of white light through the dark angular space. Suddenly, with no warning, we noticed movement at the far end of the room. A large portrait of what looked to be a Soviet official, detached from its mount at the top of the frame, swung forward and crashed down on a stack of rolling desk chairs, which were piled on the floor just in front of it. The force of the crash sent several of the chairs careening off in different directions, and the rotten frame and canvas of the portrait cracked into several pieces, filling the room with an ear-shattering crash and the squeaking of rusted chair wheels. Suffice to say, that was enough of an experience for the both of us, and we quickly and efficiently made our way back to the rental car. A couple of minutes later, we were back on the road to Costanay, where we would stay for the night. I would say sleep, but neither of us got much sleep that night. The Dollhouse Ghost by Captain-Alexandria. Ever since I was little, me and my family would go and stay at my grandmother's for the weekend every other month. She lived in a little cottage in what seemed to be the middle of nowhere. She had 2 spare bedrooms, which me and my brother used, and my mum and dad would sleep on the sofas. Anyway, in my room was a very old dollhouse. It was quite big, I would say about 3 feet high and 4 feet wide. It was always just a normal dollhouse to me. I was 10 when it happened. I remember I was in the garden with my brother, and we decided to dig a hole at the bottom of it. We used a spoon to dig, because we didn't want our grandmother to know what we were doing. As we were digging, I noticed a small wooden doll. She was only about 3 inches tall, and had a dirty pink dress on. Instantly, I ran up to the house, cleaned her up, and placed her in the doll's house. Later that night, Mum took me up into bed and closed the dollhouse. I remember waking up in the middle of the night. I'm not sure what woke me, but I won't ever forget what I saw. I heard a creaking noise, so I sat up and turned the bedside lamp on. Looking around to see what it was, I noticed that the dollhouse was open, and all the furniture and dolls were on the floor, except for the little doll that I had found earlier that day. She was at the top room in the house, tucked into the little doll's bed. I remember, after I had noticed the little doll, the room went cold, so I turned my lamp off and tried going back to sleep to get warm. I remember not being able to sleep. I must have just been laying there for over 30 minutes. Then, I heard that same creak again, followed by a sort of whisper. It sounded like a little girl. I don't know exactly what it was saying, but it was something like, "Thank you for bringing her home." I remember waking up in the morning and thinking it was just a dream, but to my surprise, the dollhouse was there just as it was the night before. All the furniture was scattered on the floor, and sure enough, the little doll was in bed in the top room. I've never forgotten that night, and never said anything to my parents or grandmother. It was 2 years ago when I decided to search my grandmother's house on the internet. It turns out it was built in the early 1900s, and was once occupied by a married couple and their 7-year-old daughter. It didn't say how, but it said that the daughter had died in the back garden while she was playing. After the little girl's death, the parents moved out of their home, leaving behind a big wooden dollhouse, the same as my grandmother had in her home. I asked my grandmother about the dollhouse and where she got it from. She said it was already in the house when she moved in. So I guess the little girl who whispered to me that night was the little girl who died all those years ago. I'm not sure if I'm correct, but it said that she was playing in the garden when she died, so it must have been the little doll she was playing with, but it never got returned to its house, which could be the reason she thanked me all those years ago. I brought her doll home. Hi guys, thank you so much for listening to today's video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, making sure you hit the notification bell so that you know when the next video goes live. So, until next time, sleep tight.